much, everyone, for coming, for joining us tonight. I'm your host for the evening. My name is Kate. I'm actually half Russian, half Ukrainian, but you're not going to see much of me today. I'm only here for you to introduce you to our amazing speakers. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to introduce you our keynote speaker for this evening. He is a cognitive psychologist, linguist, and popular science author. And he also happens to be my most favorite professor. He has been named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world, has won many, many awards for his research on human cognition and language. He is author of several best-selling books, including The Language Instinct, Enlightenment Now, How the Mind Works. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Steven Pinker.
Thank you, Kate. Well, it's obvious. The main reason why Ukraine matters is pretty obvious. It's because Ukrainians matter. And just about a year ago, a little less than a year ago, I received an email from a man that I had purchased some software from in past years, and we exchanged correspondence every now and again. And he sent me a photograph that was taken just about a year ago of him and his daughter. They were out for a weekend having pizza at a shopping mall. Then I was afraid I would not be able to make it through this. Then their world changed. We have airstrike emergencies every night and often during the day, and we have to hide. Many places, houses, and so on are totally destroyed. I still cannot believe this happens again after the 1940s. What's especially sad, my daughter is under 5 years old, and she is quite afraid. No way to fully calm her. So this is why Ukraine matters. Multiply that by 20 million, and it's an excellent reason to support the cause that has brought us together tonight, Cash for Refugees. The invasion of Ukraine almost a year ago today is bitterly ironic for me for another reason, because it was that week that was the publication date for the Ukrainian translation of my book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, which documented, among other things, the historical trajectory of war, showing that war had been in decline for at least 70 years, and in some ways longer. Now, a frequently asked question is, and I got this not only after the invasion of, is this working? Here we go. Not only after the invasion, but every time there is a terrorist attack or a school shooting, doesn't this go against your theory that violence has declined? I actually don't have a theory that violence has declined. What I did in the book was present many data showing that violence has declined. Not everywhere or always. That would be a miracle if true. And the decline of violence isn't a miracle, but it is, I hope to show you, an unmistakable historical trend. Like all historical trends, it's not linear, it's not monotonic, but it can be real for all that. So what I would like to do this evening is put Putin's invasion in the context of the history of war. What does this mean for human history over the long term, and what does it mean for the future? Is the sound okay, by the way? You can hear me? Closer? This sounded a little too echoey. It's better? Really? Okay. So let me begin with a brief history of the last half millennium of major war. In particular, we are going to show you wars between great powers. Great powers are the 800-pound gorillas in any time or place, the empires and states that can project military force beyond their borders. Wars involving a great power account for the lion's share of deaths from all wars put together. A few big wars kill many more people than a lot of little wars. And wars between great powers, with a great power on each side, are what we would today call world wars. So this first graph simply shows the percentage of years in every 25-year period over the last half millennium at which the great powers were at each other's throats. And what it shows is that a few hundred years ago, the great powers were pretty much always at war. And in recent times, they have never been at war. The last great power war, that is with a great power on each side, was pitted the United States against China during the Korean War more than 60 years ago. I'm going to switch now to wars that have a great power just on at least one side. And I'll start with the frequency. And as you can see, for the last half millennium, wars involving a great power, and again, these are the wars that really count because they kill the most people, have become fewer in number. This graph shows the duration of wars involving a great power, and they show that wars have been getting shorter. We used to have things like the 30 Years' War, the 80 Years' War, the 100 Years' War. Those don't happen anymore. On the other hand, there is a trend that for most of this period went in the opposite direction, and that is the deadliness of war. In a perverse example of, I guess, unprogress, states became better at killing more and more people, not only because weaponry improved, but because they were better at conscripting cannon fodder and efficiently getting it to the front lines. So as you can see, until around 1950, wars became deadlier. Do I have a laser pointer here? I guess not. Nations became better at killing more people per country per year. All that did a U-turn after World War II, and then wars became less deadly as well. So if we combine these three measures, that is how often great powers fought, how long they fought, and how lethal were their fights, you get a kind of zigzag, but it is one whose lowest point in the last 500 years is in the last quarter of the 20th century. Let's zoom in on the 20th century. And here we see that the 20th century had two horrific spikes of bloodletting centered on the two world wars, but the graph after 1946 becomes something of a wrinkled carpet. This is the era in history that some historians have called the long peace. The fact that since 1945 there's been a historically unusual decline in interstate war. That's wars between countries, civil wars I'll get to later. And during this period, there's been virtually no significant permanent conquest of territory by military force. You look at the lines on a map today, the lines of the map in 1946, a lot of the big countries and empires fractionated into smaller countries, but very few boundaries were changed by force. In fact, the most significant data from this post-war period is zero. There were zero direct wars between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, contrary to every prediction that every expert had made during this time. When I entered graduate school at Harvard in 1976, our entering class was greeted by the great MIT computer scientist Joseph Weizenbaum, who gave a talk advising us not to work for the CIA and not to work for the military, and he ended his talk by saying, well, it doesn't matter what I tell you, because I'm absolutely sure there is not the slightest doubt in my mind that by the year 2000, you will all be dead. And that is how he welcomed the graduating class that entered in 1976. So fortunately, he was wrong. No nuclear weapons were used. He was wrong about that too. I don't want to make fun of the late Professor Weizenbaum, because this was almost a consensus among experts in everything. As I mentioned, there have been no wars between great powers, that is, uniformed soldiers facing each other on the battlefield since 1953. No wars between Western European countries, which almost sounds like a boring non-fact. Like you might think, oh, well, people who have grown up since then, well, of course. I mean, who would ever expect, say, France and Germany to fight a war? But needless to say, this is a historically extraordinary development. Before 1945, Western European countries alone started 2 new wars a year for 600 years. After 1945, that went to 0. And no wars between developed countries. The 40 countries with the highest GDP per capita have not fought each other since 1945. Well, as I said, I don't believe that there is any arc bending toward peace. I don't believe that there is any cosmic force that drags us away from war and toward peace. As the humorist Fran Lebowitz once said, I don't believe in anything you have to believe in. If we see an unusual development, such as the decline in war, we've got to look at the causes. And when the causes are not operative, war can come back. So what caused the long peace? Probably the first the first thinker to actually treat war as a matter of cause and effect, as opposed to, say, gods toying with us for their amusement, or some cosmic drama that we are fated to play. It was Immanuel Kant, who in a brilliant little essay called Perpetual Peace, proposed that what we would today call democracy, trade, and an international community disincentivized leaders from dragging their countries into war. Democracy, because the benefits of war may go to leaders in the form of conquest and glory, but it's the citizens who pay the price when they are conscripted as cannon fodder. And if you have a political system in which the people have a say, they may be less willing to indulge their leaders in stupid wars. Trade, because if it's cheaper to buy stuff than to steal it, then that removes one of the incentives for conquest. And if countries are knitted together in networks of commerce, then it's just good business. You don't kill your customers. You don't kill your debtors. And an international community capitalizes on the fact that all humans are subject to norms and expectations and taboos. And if there is a social club of respectable members, then there are just some things that you just don't do if you want to continue to be a member of the club. Today, Kant's triad, his benevolent triangle, has been joined by other possible causes, and there's a lively debate among international relations scholars as to which of these was most potent, or it doesn't have to be just one, probably a number of them acted in concert. The fact that wealth no longer comes from land, which was the case for most of human history until the Industrial Revolution, and even less so with the various technological revolutions, and less on natural resources, means that an incentive for conquest has been removed. Some of the most vicious, war-torn and poor countries are overflowing with resources, and some of the most peaceful and wealthiest countries have none. Like Singapore, like Israel, like the Netherlands. It's sometimes said that there's no silicon in Silicon Valley, and indeed it would not make sense for some country to try to invade Silicon Valley if they wanted to share in its riches. It's knowledge rather than stuff that drives modern economies. I mentioned the growth of commerce and global and regional interstate organizations. There's no global Leviathan, global government. That was a cause among intellectuals in the 1950s, but it didn't happen, and it almost certainly won't. Nonetheless, there's a network of organizations that have rules, expectations, norms, laws, no direct teeth, but nonetheless, the members benefit from belonging to those organizations, and they at least have an incentive not to run afoul of them. Another possible reason is that war is literally illegal. This is an argument made by Una Hathaway and Scott Shapiro in their book, The Internationalists, that even though many of us remember snickering at the Kellogg-Briand Pact of 1928, which declared war to be illegal, since it obviously did not prevent the Second World War. Nonetheless, it was really only put into effect with the founding of the United Nations in 1945. And they argued that it did make a significant difference that prior to 1945, war was actually, as von Clausewitz said, the pursuit of diplomacy by other means. It was perfectly legitimate if one country had a grievance against another to declare war, conquer some territory, and to expect that the international community would recognize the conquest. The reason, for example, that we have states in this country called Colorado and Nevada and Arizona and California is that they were stolen from Mexico in a war to avenge unpaid debts. Now, and no one has a problem anymore with the fact that California was acquired by conquest, but nowadays that would be much less likely to happen because all countries are signatories to an agreement that they may not conquer territory by force. War is never legitimate except with the approval of the Security Council or in self-defense. The expansion of peacekeeping forces, which like referees in an obstreperous hockey game can pull apart brawnier players, and there are studies that show that on average holding the type of conflict constant, UN and other ad hoc peacekeeping forces really do keep the peace on average, not always. And just a little more nebulously, but still potentially powerfully, norms that prioritize human life and prosperity over national and religious glory. Just the idea that the main goal in life is not to make your country as big and as glorious as possible, but to allow people to live the best possible lives. Indeed, the attitude toward war itself did a rather amazing flip after World War I. It's hard for us to believe today, but in the 19th century and early first decade of the 20th century, war was not considered a bad thing. It was considered a good thing. The philosopher whose name adorns the building that I work at in Harvard, William James, wrote an essay called The Moral Equivalent of War, in which he proposed something like what we would today call the Peace Corps or Teach for America, forms of compulsory, well, unlike ours, the ones that we do have, which are voluntary. He wanted to make it compulsory, but young people would be drafted into organizations that would put their energy to productive use. And the reason he called it the moral equivalent of war is not because he was proposing something that would be as bad as war, but he was proposing something that would be as good as war. Because the consensus at the time was that war brought out the highest qualities in people. War was heroic, glorious, thrilling, manly, and peace, in contrast, was something to be dreaded because it would lead to society becoming selfish and decadent and hedonistic and effeminate. After World War I, that widespread consensus came to be considered ludicrous, as it was, and war acquired its current reputation as something that's stupid, wasteful, repulsive, and cruel. And if any of you wander down to the campus two stops down on the Red Line where I currently work, and go into Widener Library, the world's biggest university library, you'll see one of the paintings from the great Boston painter John Singer Sargent called Victory and Death, which shows a dead soldier in a muddy World War I field. His ghost is rising from his body, clasping a rather buxom, topless angel. And the caption is, "There are none so happy as those that together clasp victory and death." Even at the time, that was considered a bit kitsch, but it did capture a widespread attitude toward war that plummeted after the First World War in most of the world. Well, that brings us to the events of just about a year ago. And how do we account for and how do we make sense of the actions of this man who did not sign on to the idea that war is stupid, ugly, repulsive, cruel? It is certainly true that in many ways, Putin's invasion of Ukraine threatens the long peace as it's conventionally defined. It's the only interstate war in Europe since World War II, unless you count the brief Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956. First interstate war outside the Middle East or Africa in 40 years. And it has brought rates of battle death back to the levels of the late 1980s. Remember I showed you this graph for the 20th century and the first 5 years of the 21st. If we zoom in now on the period since World War II, since 1946, we see that there is a kind of a roller coaster, but one with a downward trajectory. But it goes up to 2022, data that I just got a few days ago. But as you can see, because of the invasion of Ukraine, but also the civil war in Ethiopia, in the Tigray province, fortunately terminated in November, it has brought the world back up to levels of war deaths that it had not seen since the late 1980s. That is the last year of the Cold War. And we should remember, by the way, according to the Uppsala Conflict Data Project, in the year 2022, there were 77,000 documented battle deaths in Ukraine. That is, soldiers on both sides and civilians killed as collateral damage. But we should also keep in mind that the war in Tigray killed about 100,000 people. Black Lives Matter, and that should be a cause of for our concern as well. Fortunately, it seems to have wound down. So how could Putin have defied the long peace? Why would he embark on this utterly anachronistic adventure? Well, the long peace, like all progress, was not inevitable. And I mentioned this at the outset of the talk. I don't believe in progress as some arc bending toward justice or anything else. I don't believe in it that the universe has a mystical force that lifts us ever upward. On the contrary, I think the forces of nature are going to try to grind us down. We need explanations for how anything beneficial happens, both declines of violence and the types of progress that I documented in a subsequent book, Enlightenment Now, which I plotted graphs showing that people live longer, less likely to be killed in natural accidents, women are less likely to die in childbirth, children are less likely to die in the first 5 years of life. People are less likely to die in natural disasters, in car crashes, in occupational hazards, and just about any other form of premature death. But these need an explanation. We are in a temple to science and technology, and we have to try to look at cause and effect. And the putative causes of the long peace, indeed, many of them were disabled or weakened in Putin's Russia, most obviously democracy. We've all read about the draconian penalties for even calling it a war, let alone speaking out against the war among Russians. The fact that the general worldview of Enlightenment humanism, that the ultimate good is the life, liberty, and happiness of individuals, with governments instituted as social contracts to secure these rights, that is a conception of natural rights and the role of the state that is alien to Putin and to many world leaders, who subscribe instead to a philosophy that was dominant in the 19th century that you can call romantic nationalism, where the ultimate good is the prestige of ethno-states or ethnic nations, and governments and strong leaders are their embodiments. They are the carriers of the soul of the nation, and nations naturally struggle to stake out spheres of influence and rectify historic humiliations. An utterly different philosophy of what matters and what states are for. Well, will Putin's war reverse the long peace and send us back to an era of warring great powers? And the answer is maybe, but maybe not. And there are signs that the world has changed enough so that even this tremendous insult, this tremendous disruption, has not turned back the clock. Most obviously, the United States and the European Union, at least so far, have refused to send armies to fight Russia's. So that means that we do not have a great power war, that is, the armies of two great powers fighting each other. Putin is unlikely to use nuclear weapons, though it is a threat that clearly we have to take seriously. But and I say this not just out of hope or optimism, but out of probably the most reliable source for predictions in an uncertain world, namely prediction markets such as Metaculus, which in March predicted for the rest of 2022 that there was less than a 1% chance that Putin would detonate a nuclear weapon in Ukraine, and a third of a percentage point of a chance that it would escalate to full-scale nuclear war. Now, these are still terrifying numbers. They are alarmingly higher than zero, but it also means that almost certainly that it would not happen. And if anything, because Putin has actually soft-pedaled nuclear weapons, China, his closest ally, has told him this would be a terrible thing, don't do it. The odds, at least so far, might be even less. Perhaps most importantly, Putin has achieved none of his goals. He has not succeeded in restoring Greater Russia. He has not succeeded in sowing discord and disunity in Ukraine. He has not succeeded in discouraging Ukraine from allying with the West. He has not succeeded in halting the expansion of NATO, now that Sweden and Finland are almost certain to join. Certainly has not earned respect for Russia and its military. And it's very unlikely that he'll be remembered in history like Peter the Great. More likely he'll be remembered as Vladimir the Fool, or my favorite, Vlad the Self-Impaler. So it is hard to take comfort from anything that has taken place during the past year in Ukraine, but one can imagine an alternative and even worse possible world, history in which Putin would have achieved his goals, therefore vindicating the wisdom of war in pursuing at least some of these romantic nationalist goals. Now, one thing that I certainly found repeatedly in documenting declines of violence over the centuries and millennia is that they're never, they're certainly never linear, and here at MIT I can use the word monotonic. That is, none of them always go down, never ever reversing or showing blips or lurches or reversals. Indeed, many humanitarian advances in history did suffer episodes of backsliding. Those of you who are familiar with the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, know that although the Judeans had outlawed human sacrifice, God had to keep reminding them not to succumb to the temptation to sacrifice their children on the altar at Tophet, showing that at the time it was still something that, for the perverse reasons people had, they found tempting. Nonetheless, human sacrifice is a practice that was done by every ancient civilization. Then every single one of them eventually abolished it, though again, not without some backsliding. And slavery, France has the dubious distinction of having abolished slavery twice. Once around the time of the Revolution, but then Napoleon brought it back and it had to be abolished a second time in 1848. But nonetheless, as I will soon show you, the abolition of human sacrifice, the abolition of slavery resumed, proceeded, and eventually brought the world to zero. Perhaps, this is a big perhaps, but it is not totally crazy, romantic, utopian to think that this could happen to wars between countries, interstate wars. Now, civil wars are a different matter. I don't think that it is particularly reasonable to even imagine an end to civil wars, because all it takes is a bunch of young men who get their hands on some AK-47s and call themselves the Popular Front for the Liberation of whatever, and you can have a civil war. And there are endless opportunities for them to arise. But the world only has 193 countries, and the possibility that that war between them might go the way of human sacrifice, of throwing virgins into volcanoes, of slave auctions, is a thinkable thought. So it leads to the question, will the last World War be the last World War? Or another way of putting it is, were Bob Dylan, Peter, Paul and Mary, John and Yoko, and the cast of Hair right in hoping for a permanent end to war? Again, I am the last person that you could call a naive about human nature. I wrote a book called The Blank Slate, arguing that there is such a thing as human nature, including a lot of rather ugly, nasty traits. But though I would not bet a lot of money that it will happen, I don't think it's insanely romantic either. Because some barbaric customs, once abolished, stay abolished. That has happened many times, such as sadistic forms of corporal and capital punishment, like breaking on the wheel, burning at the stake, clawing with iron hooks, sawing from the crotch down, and impalement through the rectum. These were common in medieval Europe, and fortunately they're gone. Here you have a timeline of countries that abolished the use of judicial torture, including the United States with the 8th Amendment to the Constitution banning cruel and unusual punishment, which took place right in the middle of this trend. More generally, the death penalty has been abolished for crime after crime and may go the way of human sacrifice. In 18th century England, there were 220 capital offenses on the books, including poaching, counterfeiting, robbing a rabbit warren, being in the company of gypsies, and, quote, strong evidence of malice in a child aged 7 to 14 years of age. By 1861, that had been reduced to 4, and of course, England, like most countries in the world, not the United States, which is often a laggard in these trends, has abolished capital punishment outright. Here's a timeline of abolitions, and even in the United States, which to the surprise and to our own shame continues the practice, but state after state in the United States either has formally abolished it or hasn't de facto executed anyone in decades. And I think it's not at all unreasonable to expect that within the lifetime of some people in this room, capital punishment will have vanished from the face of the earth. Other things that have vanished, not everywhere, but from large swaths of the earth, are witch hunts, religious persecution, dueling among men of honor. You don't see the Secretary of the Treasury and the Vice President challenge each other to a fatal duel anymore. Many blood sports like bear baiting and cockfighting, debtors' prisons, slavery, most famously. Slavery, like human sacrifice, used to be practiced in every large civilization. But beginning with in the 18th century, with the Enlightenment, there was a trickle of abolitions that grew into a wave, culminating in 1980 when Mauritania became the last country on earth to have legal chattel slavery. A few others. I mentioned human sacrifice. Cannibalism used to be pretty widespread. Don't see it very much anymore. Leaders of countries that have harems guarded by eunuchs. That tends not to happen, no matter how barbaric our world is. We seem to have outgrown that. I mentioned debtors' prisoners, or bringing out the whole family on a Sunday afternoon for an afternoon of entertainment by laughing at the people in an insane asylum. A wholesome entertainment in the 19th century, but that has vanished. So could major interstate war be next? Again, I would not go to a prediction market and bet a lot of money on it in my lifetime, but I don't think it is crazy. So it may not. The contributors to the long peace, as I've mentioned, are threatened. Democracy, we have seen pushbacks in a number of countries, including the United States. Trade is threatened by protectionist movements in a number of countries, including ours. International laws and institutions are being denigrated and insulted. And some countries still can't get out of the habit of valuing national greatness over human flourishing. And perhaps most terrifyingly, Putin's invasion was a breach of the widespread taboo on armed conquest. Nonetheless, Putin's failure could remind the world why these norms and practices arose in the first place after 1945, why we should respect and value and cherish and protect them, because they are what could renew the long peace, could hasten the abolition of interstate war, and continue the historical decline of violence. And that is a major reason why Ukraine matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Pinker. I'm actually a terrible host. I completely forgot to tell you the agenda for tonight. So after Professor Pinker, we're going to hear from Sabastian, and then CEO of Cash for Refugees, Natasha Dukach. And after that, we'll have a Q&A session with Professor Pinker. So ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor to introduce you to our next speaker. He is a former U.S. Army Green Beret who put his education on pause to answer the call of duty. At the start of the war, Sabastian withdrew from Harvard to provide mental support and medical support, I'm sure mental as well, and training in Ukraine. He stayed there for 6 months, and now he returned to Harvard to complete his education in biology. I think that Sabastian is a true hero. Welcome, Sabastian Mandel.
Hello again, and thank you all for being here. The title of the event is Why Ukraine Matters. It's an important question. There's no shortage of arguments that substitute ideologies for the simple truth of a fight for one's home. You may ask, what business is it of mine what happens in Ukraine? It's because despite all the noise, I know that I too need a home. So the real question becomes, how does Ukraine not matter? Orwell said about the Spanish Civil War, the International Brigade is in some sense fighting for all of us. It is a thin line of suffering, often ill-armed humans standing between barbarism and at least comparative decency. In essence, this could be said about Ukraine. In my opinion, the Western world owes them a debt of gratitude for their valor and sacrifice, and perhaps not solely that for forming the line of suffering between power and ideas which see land and people as disposable, but also for demonstrating that courage and sacrifice are some of the only values which truly halt the mechanisms of violence and extortion. Before I continue on with my story, as an outsider, I'd like to share some words from someone who is from Ukraine, a famed poet and cultural symbol, Taras Shevchenko. I believe this poem encapsulates some of the sense of beauty and ownership of one's home, as well as the sacrifice and the indomitable spirit that has come to be identified with the Ukrainians. When I am dead, bury me in my beloved Ukraine, my tomb upon a grave mound high amid the spreading plain, so that the fields, the boundless steeps, the Dniepro's plunging shore, my eyes could see, my ears could hear the mighty river roar. When from Ukraine the Dnieper bears into the deep blue sea the blood of foes, then will I leave these hills and fertile fields. I'll leave them all and fly away to the abode of God, and then I'll pray. But until that day, I know nothing of God. Oh, bury me, then rise ye up and break your heavy chains, and water with the tyrant's blood the freedom you have gained. And in the great new family, the family of the free, with softly spoken kindly words, remember also me. Translated by John Weir. People often ask me what it was like in Ukraine. In spite of the horrible things taking place, being there was one of the most meaningful times in my life. From the moment the invasion began, the gravity of the war sucked me in. I was obsessively watching news, ignoring assignments, and hardly sleeping. I was no stranger to violent affairs in foreign countries. I had left the army 2 years earlier to start a life as a civilian. I had gone skiing for the first time and broke my collarbone hardly a month before, and I could barely lift my arm. But there I was, totally consumed, wondering if I should go or stay. If I was a coward for hesitating, a hypocrite, or was it practical to see myself as a one-armed illiterate, unsuited for this task? I helped my friend pack his things, and he left almost instantly. Was I filled with rationality or cowardice? The problem wasn't going away. Either I had to go, or I had to turn my back on the very identity that I had lived my life trying to build. So no. The arm would heal en route, and in the meantime, there had to be plenty I could do to help. As my friend reminded me, medical skills were valuable. I found an organization, the Global Surgical Medical Support Group, that works with surgeons and ex-medics to bring training, supplies, and treatment to war-torn regions. They were seeking volunteers for 2 to 6 week rotations willing to fly into Poland and cross the border. I withdrew from my courses, and I flew out. I saw many others, some wearing military clothes and gear, wandering the terminals. You could tell many of them had no military background whatsoever. One had ceremonial dress boots over his shoulder, unaware that these were merely decorative. A new colleague of mine would try and help them flesh out their plans, and he would always say, "Be careful. I know you want to touch war, but remember, war touches you. We heard news of border parties. Foreigners would book hotels and meet in cafes and bars in Poland and form small bands, making plans to cross the border. One benefit of an organization of veterans was their expertise. Within those first 2 weeks, others had already established a network of logistics, government support, and units ready to work with us. It wasn't glamorous, but we seemed to be some of the few with a skeleton of a plan. When we crossed the border, we saw miles and miles of trucks and buses on either side, an endless train of supplies and refugees stalled in the queues skirting Poland and Ukraine. Huddles of women and small children hanging out of bus windows and bundled in blankets with freeze-dried lips and tear-stained cheeks. I remember the border control guard from the first night. She ordered us around with little patience. Stand, wait, go, stop. She looked like she was in her mid to late 20s and was 7 months pregnant. Her eyes had a deep concern in the chaos and uncertainty, a compassion for the refugees around her, but also ferocity. She had no interest in pity from us and was wholly focused on her charge. Perhaps it was the jet lag or the lack of sleep, but the effect might have been permanent. Whenever someone mentions strong or remarkable women, I see her in my mind. We spent the first several weeks in a refugee-filled hostel on the outskirts of Lviv, sleeping on steel bunks. The city was a ghost town with sandbag defense positions everywhere. A small amount of commerce and an air of suspicion lingering like fog over the asphalt. We traveled to basements and cafes and taught physicians how to do chest tubes or basic trauma interventions. We visited community centers and trained scores of civilians first aid. We spent time with military units, teaching them emergency planning and T-Tri-C, the official medical doctrine of the U.S. military. Whenever we got our hands on supplies, we tried to distribute them to whoever we thought would need them the soonest. It was my first time in Eastern Europe, and it was like being in a different world, a world with beautiful historical architecture, cathedrals, large slabs of Soviet-era apartment complexes, and 21st century storefronts. The battlefields were full of trenches, forces dug into the earth like World War I and gridlocked between artillery and drones. Trench warfare with drones. The future and past blended together in strange ways. A war waged with old rifles from generations past and limited ammunition, but equally fought with cell phones and social media. During one air raid, Simon regathered with our military students in a bomb shelter. We listened to a soldier play haunting melodies on an out-of-tune piano covered in dust and debris, while we wondered if our encampment was of enough strategic importance to earn us a cruise missile. Every few days, the group would discuss the current situation and determine what level of risk we could take. Some wanted to move more aggressively and some more cautiously. Spent a couple weeks scouting the rail systems and sending one or two eastward to see if it was possible to move there. As the Russians began retreating from Kiev, we were moving into it. Our first stop was the areas around Bucha and Irpin, and we trained what may be called the Ukrainian National Guard, the Territorial Defense Forces. And we moved through the area just as the forensic officers were digging up the bodies of the genocide that had taken place within the last week or so. The visceral hate, disgust, and sorrow was palpable in everyone's eyes, as if the smell of the burned and innocent bodies only a few miles away covered the whole region. Countless dogs with collars and no owners wandered around the rubble. Dozens of incinerated tanks and demolished buildings, road signs marked with machine gun fire and spray paint reading, "Mine here," painted the backdrop of these suburbs. Other disturbing feelings started to emerge in me from the social media news outlets. Western news using words like claimed and verified or accused, and then those voices blended with the Russian propaganda. We were evil biomedical researchers from the West. Organ traffickers, rapists, you name it. A few volunteers who kept social media had personal posters made about them, including bounties and absurd accusations of every sort. It seemed the truth was no longer made of solid facts. Decoupled from the ghoulish reality in front of us, the world of truth is now made of possibilities, likelihoods, and party lines. Even some Ukrainians and people across the world suspected maybe some of this was true. I watched as our translator, a young man from Luhansk, broke down into tears while he was on the phone with his grandma. She lived in the East, where Russian Federation propaganda is the only accessible media. She wailed and accused him of genocide, of Nazism, of corruption and murder. And a young man who had seen unimaginable horrors and lost everything could only cry and plead with his own grandmother to stop saying these things. Before the war, he had been in his first year of surgical residency. His home, his school, some of his family, and many of his friends are gone. To think a world exists where you can be accused of being your own torturer. It was said that Russians were still in the area. One evening, men with guns came into one of our small apartments to detain, question, and ensure our volunteers were not Russian spies. Suspicion, again, was a hallmark of the environment, and cunning games seemed to be played by all parties. Whether it was fear of Russian soldiers in disguise, corrupt bureaucracies on Russia's payroll, or local civilians confused by propaganda, there was enough reason to be suspicious. Earning trust and respect wasn't always quick or easy, but we got better at it. At the week's end, as we left towards the capital area, the guards had placed an American flag next to their defense position. We continued to travel, train, provide supplies, offer classes, and give our condolences. Often it seemed the most powerful thing we brought was just the willingness to be present. In Kiev, our daily routine wasn't much different, so I'll share 3 things that I thought were interesting. The city had been turned into a fortress. Every 10 feet along the roads were boxes of Molotov cocktails staged like lampposts, like a simulation in some strange video game. No, as if an entire city had mobilized to defend herself, refusing to be placed under the boot. We walked under the arches of friendship and saw the statue of broken promises before it was destroyed by the Ukrainian government months later. And I was allowed to play the piano in one of the ballrooms of one of the Capitol buildings. It was really cool. The C-sharp 5 key was broken. The Global Surgical Medical Support Group gained more support. I was appointed team leader for the Western area, with some of the top-tier ex-military surgeons joining us. We rotated them into country. It was a pleasure and a privilege. The last 2 months were predominantly hospital and liaison work, with some training and supply deliveries. We provided security and advice to help integrate the surgeons into the local infrastructure and culture. We moved doctors and supplies in and out of different hospitals, and it was a time I never could have predicted. I got to see the first stem cell skin graft in Ukraine. I watched as one surgeon successfully use a flap from the latissimus dorsi muscle to cover the gaping chest wound of a small child. Sometimes it was hard. The infrastructure was decades behind in some ways, and there was competing bureaucratic philosophies. A struggle between the old Soviet-era way and the new generation, drawing ideas from the West blended with their own local culture and history. In the lower-income hospitals, entire wards filled with civilian casualties, soldiers, and family members smoked cigarettes and ate oatmeal. There were men covered in burns or missing limbs. Many had not been soldiers 4 months prior. Lawyers, farmers, businessmen, you name it, but not soldiers. Many of the physicians had not been combat trauma surgeons before the war. And one of my American doctors told me, even if they weren't active trauma surgeons before the war, by the end of this year, they will be the most experienced on the planet. When it came time for me to leave, I was filled with depression and guilt. I knew I had to eventually return home. We were running out of money and volunteers, and I was personally living in limbo. My education unfinished, homeless but for a college dorm room I had lost, and I couldn't really determine which direction was running away from what. And maybe I'm still not sure. How can one look in the eyes of people they've come to admire and love, people who've had their families murdered, the raped, and the tortured, and say to them, I care for you, but I'm not willing to stay and risk my life in the fields or in the rubble. I have to return to Harvard. How can the words form in your mind and one not feel some sense of self-loathing? A soldier's purpose may be to touch war, but what do you say to those who wore grips without them having any choice? My condolences. I'm sorry. All I've been able to come up with is, at least I can bear witness. Why does Ukraine matter? What draws thousands of volunteers and veterans from across the world to give aid? I cannot debate the circumstances of geopolitical and cultural forces at high levels. I can only tell you the perspective of the soldiers. Many in this generation of volunteers believed in democracy and fighting on behalf of the oppressed, and never has the line between good and evil been clearer for them. Having risked lives and lost brothers in a cause that seemed opaque as the years went on in other parts of the world, perhaps this war was a chance to reaffirm our beliefs. And in Ukraine, the oppressed refused to surrender and lead their own charge for the freedom to choose their own future. When Milton Wolfe, the last commander of the Washington Lincoln Brigades that fought fascism in Spain, was asked why a U.S. working-class man from Brooklyn went to Spain, he answered, "It was happening in my backyard." Why does Ukraine matter? It is in our backyard. And there's something there insidious that I believe we need to understand. While most of the Russian war machine has rotted from within from its own values, its psychological and cyber warfare are all too sophisticated. Tyrants no longer need to waste resources on shells and jets, so long as they can control and influence information and ideas. In the words of Orwell, who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the past controls the future, and who controls the present controls the past. Total genocide is not necessary. Genocide as a tactic is to use it enough to leave some space so you can migrate in new populations and create a new narrative. Within 10 years, as we see in Crimea, lands and people can be erased and cities reborn with rewritten histories. Albert Camus wrote, "Many Americans would like to live prosperously in a closed-off society, while Russians perhaps would like to carry on their statist experiment aloof of the capitalist world. They cannot do so, nor will they ever be able to again. Europe's bread is in Buenos Aires. Siberian tools are made in Detroit, and German cars are fueled from Moscow. Today, tragedy is collective. The acts in Ukraine are a parody of revolution, and the parody of revolution is extermination. Are we forced to abide terror because persuasion is no longer possible? According to Camus, it is because we are submerged in history. We live in a world of abstractions, of bureaus and absolute ideas, suffocated by people who believe themselves to be absolutely right. To have international democracy, we must be willing to grant each side the right to affirm its beliefs, but refuse it the right to impose them by murder. So as technology grows more sophisticated and more subtle in its manipulations, and each of our outlines shrink in the pages of history, how will we speak of ourselves in these halls of philosophy and science, or in the stories that we tell each other about who we are? If the suffering of others is merely an abstraction, then the ends will ultimately justify the means. Entire nations can be held hostage by the momentum of history and the tyrant who rides it. And if we cannot risk ourselves or escalate violence, what can we do? At least we can bear witness. We can refuse rewriting of the past and the effort of power to keep truth at arm's length. We can protect the would-be erased and hold on to our principles as we take small actions and do what we can to preserve humanity from the momentum of history. Why does Ukraine matter? How can it not? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. So allow me, please, to introduce you our last speaker for the night. She is actually the reason we're all here tonight. She is a professional violinist. I don't know if she's going to agree to play for us. Epidemiologist and ethnomusicologist. I'm sorry if I butchered that word. She is simply a badass. When I was in Ukraine with her in October, I knew nothing is going to happen to me because no one can stand on her way. Please welcome CEO of Cash for Refugees, Natasha Dukach.
Hey. So to give a little bit of context, Cash for Refugees speaks for itself. We give cash to refugees, and we covered 15,000 families since the war started, which is translated about 40,000 people. Normally, how it looks when we arrive to some very distant village in Ukraine, and there is only, let's say, 12 families, moms with children, and those children are not even their kids, because moms adopt children whom they found on streets, abandoned or unaccompanied, in order to prevent those children to be sent to Russia for education and erasing their cultural identity. So the whole reason for us to arrive to those distant villages is that large humanitarian aid organizations are not present there. Nobody is gonna spend fuel, volunteer power, time traveling to some village for 12 families. So it's usually like that. Kate, where are you? So we sit there, we wait for people, we announce on the local radio, because sometimes electricity is not there and people need to get their news that they arrived to the village, to give $150 to a mom with kids. And we sit there the entire week. Electricity, no electricity, heat, no heat, water, no water. We just sit there. Some local administration, it's whatever, sometimes in the basement because of sirens, or anywhere where people can come and see us. And when we announce our presence in the ground, we just say hey, bring your original documents, mom's passports, kids' birth certificates, adoption certificates, and there is piece of paper that you are internally displaced, so you lived in the area that is bombed and completely erased right now, and you happen to be in this village. And and they just arrive throughout the whole day. We were working 10, 11 hours a day, and mom comes, she sits in front of me, and first I actually didn't know what to ask, asking her questions about how do you feel? She's or oh, what are you doing here? It's how would you start a conversation with the person who is coming to get help and decide for herself and her children what they need? That's it. That's why they're there. At the same time, you really want to understand what those people are coming through, because as Sebastian said, we are the witnesses there. We collect data, we document their responses, we just we ask them questions, not just where they're from, but how they feel, what they feel about kids, how kids are doing, what kids ask them, what kind of questions. So we carefully put this into the notes in our database. So there is a mom, and eventually we just came up with 3 essential questions, which will pinpoint her in her past, her present, and the future. And these questions I asked all volunteers kind of ask gently during the interview. The first one is where you guys came from and how you came, how you happen to be here. So she goes back and she's okay, how I'm happen to be here, where I'm from, I don't know where I'm from. The second question would be okay, so we are just giving you this financial aid, $150. Do you guys, what do you want to spend it for? But if you're not going to tell us, fine, just yours, that's what the reason we're here. And the third one is what are your plans for the future? That's the most amazing question, because the answer is usually well, no, I'm going to come back, I'm going to rebuild, I'm going to well, my kids, you know what, my kids, they don't get piano lessons that they used before. And you sit in this basement with them, it's cold and dark, and there is no electricity, literally with a flashlight or that, and they're just oh, your kids don't have piano lessons. Damn. So that's the witnessing part of it. That's what I think is the most valuable, what we're doing there. It's not about even giving money, it's just about understanding how people react to this war. They're not heroes. They're not you can refer to them, oh, this mama, she adopted 10 kids. I'm not exaggerating. There is a woman. She was going from Donetsk. She was traveling to Lutsk, which is on the western part of Ukraine. Along the way, in addition to her 3 kids, she adopted 7. And those 7 kids were just randomly walking down the road. And we talk to her. And she's not just fun. There we have like so many of those. Anyways, here is a short history. When the war started, I was like not present. Like February 24, I was like, I couldn't believe it. That was like, I'm witnessing these times. And Simeon just was watching that. And then I said, like, you know what? I'm going. I need to see it. And he's like, okay, I'm going with you. And we arrived to the border with Romania and Ukraine. And we saw so many people like going from Ukraine to Romania. And I negotiated with the border control to let us stay right there at the border and check mom's documents with kids or people 65 and older and put $100 into their passports. So, and when we were doing that, we were just like, okay, welcome to you. You feel safe. And yeah, so this is how we knew that we are indeed doing something really like timely and extremely efficient, because other organizations had like banana socks, I don't know, Band-Aids there, but nobody was getting cash. So we covered here on all borders. So then I left the team 1, 2, and 3 at Chernivtsi, on the border with Romania and Ukraine, and I moved with the other team to Poland and later to Slovakia, doing basically the same. We're just checking the passports and putting $100 into their passports. But then in April, the traffic subsided, and we decided to move inside of Ukraine. So we came to Chernivtsi first, and we were doing these live interviews that I just described. So we started going to very distant like villages here around, where usually like Red Cross or UNICEF, just it makes no sense for them to travel there. So we were just checking people's passports and collected information, created an mobile app and a database. So we were like collecting lots of demographic data, and we were asking for the consent. Since I have training in epidemiology and worked as a clinical analyst in MDH before the war started, I knew how to do that. So, and then we moved like to all of those areas on the west, collected data for about 10,000 families, and their responses, how this war affected them. Well, you can see the numbers. The distribution of like demographic distribution, majority of those are moms with kids. So I think I kind of already got some questions about why we are doing this just for people in, like in Ukraine. There are so many other wars. And I never planned to do that. I never was thought that I'll be doing what I'm doing right now. But I see the great need of giving cash to people's hands once you personally meet with them, understand their need, and without patronizing what to buy, what to spend it for, just give them the choice what to buy right now. You let them to buy time. So this is a time to come down, to think that, okay, my basic needs are covered for the next couple weeks. And for moms with kids and for the elderly, they just can think further, like, okay, what would be my next steps? So please, if you guys received the envelopes, please look inside. There is a QR code. And if you can pledge some to donate for our next mission, because we're also going a second time to the Kherson region or here, or to Kharkiv. That will be as soon as we get enough funds to cover 1,000 families. This is it, Cash for Refugees, and it's a real chance to help. And if you really want to know more about demographic data and the recent research that the Yale University conducted, they also confirm our findings about saving kids in Ukraine while it's all happening. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Please donate so I can go to Kherson in April. That's my personal desire. So now we're going to have a Q&A session for Dr. Steven Pinker. We have a second mic somewhere. So what's going to happen is I'm going to ask Vade, could you please stand here, and then people line up and ask away. And I'm going to give you the second mic.
What should be done to end this horror?
Oh, man. I guess, if I knew, maybe I'd win the Nobel Peace Prize. I'll throw out an idea from someone who has won a Nobel Peace Prize, although I don't know if I would advocate this myself. I think the agonizing dilemma the world is facing is not to concede anything, not to reward this vicious, cruel aggression. On the other hand, the danger of setting some precedent that violating the taboo on invasion and conquest might set in the future has to be traded off against the suffering of the Ukrainian people now. And how to kind of provide, assuming that outright military defeat of Russia isn't possible. Now, I, like many, hope that it is. If I were to estimate what is that a reasonable prospect, it's not so clear. It should be pursued with all energy and heroism and resources and resolve, but it may not happen, in which case, are we condemned to a grinding war of attrition that would go on for a decade, like in the Russians and the Soviets in Afghanistan, or the Americans in Vietnam? Or is there some way to save tens of thousands or more lives, but at the same time not concede that aggression pays? So one idea from a man named Oscar Arias, former president of Costa Rica, who won a Nobel Peace Prize for bringing peace to that region, suggested a gesture that he argues is utterly meaningless in terms of military prowess, of strategic advantage, but nonetheless could be seen as a cosmetic concession, and that would be removing the NATO's nuclear weapons from European soil. The argument is militarily, in general, nuclear weapons are militarily pretty useless because they contaminate your own soil with radioactivity. They invite possibly devastating retaliation. But even if they weren't, the gravity-based bomber-carried nukes on European soil are completely redundant with the submarine-launched missiles and the whole insanely large nuclear arsenal that NATO has anyway. Putin, for whatever reason, the presence of nuclear weapons on Western European soil is kind of sticks in his craw. If doing something that would not lead to any military weakness, and it's probably in the interests of NATO to do anyway, since they're militarily useless, if it would bring an end to the war, and Putin could claim, well, look, I got Europe to get rid of the nuclear weapons on European soil. That's one imaginable scenario. I think the chances of it happening are very small, and it might have disadvantages, but I'm just throwing an idea out there. There may be others that, short of what I think most of us would hope for, dream of, wish for, the best possible outcome would be an outright military defeat. If that doesn't happen, then providing some way of stopping the war before it just grinds on at the cost of more tens of thousands of lives would be desirable. But at the same time, walking that fine balance so as not to make it okay to invade to get something meaningful or something that you want. But that's not an answer to your question, and but it's kind of the territory that we ought to explore more.
I'll give you the mic. Also, feel free to ask Natasha and Sebastian as well, if you please.
In thinking about this question, I hope it sounds as ridiculous as asking how people would keep the peace without public killings. But with the huge values difference between countries, like now we have the judicial system, we have the Supreme Court to resolve things, but it doesn't seem like we have international. What mechanisms do we either have or do you hope are built in scenarios where war no longer exists?
Yeah, there would have to be some patchwork of organizations that would have that would command the respect of nations, that would have some enforcement in terms of sanctions or withdrawal of privileges, that would fall well short of a global Leviathan. But nonetheless, as the countries get more knitted and depend on each other for problems that are inherently global, like international terrorism, like climate change, like pandemics, like piracy, like cyber sabotage, where you really do want to belong to the club for selfish reasons. You don't want to be kicked out. You don't want to be sanctioned. And of course, Russia is being punished. It's not the same as being hauled off to jail and hauled off to court, tried and imprisoned. But it is it does impose consequences. And already, in many cases, nations bring their disputes to various international tribunals and international law forums, and often abide by the decisions, simply because they don't want to be rogues and be booted out of the organization with all the benefits of international cooperation that it brings. So networks like that, this is why, despite the many of the dangers and the costs of globalization, ultimately the interdependence of nations is what we're going to have instead of a world government, and it's probably better than sheer anarchy.
So one thing that really stuck with me in Sebastian's speech, and by the way, deep respect to you, sir, for what you did, was this story of the grandson speaking to his grandmother on the phone and crying because his grandmother was essentially saying, "I don't believe you, grandson, that what you're saying is true. I believe what my TV is telling me is true." And this really is pretty common from what I hear. I've spoken to a number of Ukrainian friends, and they would speak to relatives in Russia, for example, which is a pretty common occurrence in this space. And they would encounter the same thing. Families no longer able to speak to each other because basically the Russians are tiptoeing the political line and the propaganda of their state. Now, you, Dr. Pinker, you have thought not only about human nature, including its dark sides, but also more recently about rationality and also its perversions, motivated reasoning, and other such phenomena. Does this kind of story surprise you? Are you struck by just how much these contextual, political, identity-based, and all these other factors can distort our thinking? Or are you basically thinking, yeah, well, that's what happens?
Yeah, it does shock me, although it isn't unprecedented. And as a psychologist, I do know that there can be perverse networks of intimidation and sharing that can cause a bizarre consensus to take hold of a closed community. The famous examples from any introductory psychology course are the experiments in the 1950s, where you have a group of people around a table asked to judge the relative lengths of different lines on cards, all of whom except the last person going around the table are paid stooges of the experimenter. And when the everyone goes around and points to a line that is just obviously shorter than the neighbor and says it's longer, kind of defying their own eyeballs. And it gets to that poor schnook at the end of the table who goes 8th out of 8, and 7 out of 8 all say, well, that line is longer. At least 3/4 of the time, they will defy their own eyeballs and assert something that they must know is false. This can be, these are the famous experiments of Solomon Asch, replicated many times. It depends on a particular group structure, where in particular, where there is a real or perceived enforcement in the sense of public condemnation, or even more so when it could be being hauled off to jail, then you can get people either believing things that are patently false or hiding their preference out of the terror that that they're being eavesdropped on, that they might be snitched on, they might be reported on, and you, in that case, it may not even be that people deep down cling to patently false beliefs, but they falsify their own preferences, sometimes out of the mistaken belief that everyone else believes the preposterous thing, where in the state called pluralistic ignorance, no one actually believes something, but everyone mistakenly believes that everyone else believes it, as in the emperor's new clothes. Now, this can be where people were intimidated out of fear of being called dishonest and incompetent in reporting what they saw with their own eyeballs. Now, this pluralistic ignorance, it can be vulnerable, can unravel when there is a single brave truth teller, like the little boy in the Hans Christian Andersen story, or when there's infiltration of a closed network by connections to a larger community where sometimes quite rapidly, as with the peaceful collapse of the Soviet Union, people who had been intimidated into professing loyalty to the regime, once they realized that no one else was loyal and that they weren't, that it wasn't that everyone else was crazy, everyone else was sane, nor were they crazy, then these things can suddenly collapse. But they're complex dynamics that often depend on the network structure of a community and of the ability to punish that can lead to preposterous beliefs entrenching themselves within such communities. Something that's often very hard to predict. And a lot of the speculation, will Putin be deposed? Will he be overthrown in a coup? Depends on the balance between people kind of being exposed to enough reality that they suddenly realize that they've been duped the whole time, or many people who know the truth but have been intimidated against expressing it, all can flip very quickly. But on the other hand, the intimidation and punishment and repression can also keep it in place for a long period.
Dr. Pinker, perhaps we could address the issue of censorship, maybe in both communities, and how we can keep open dialogue going so that we can avoid some of these conflicts in the future. Is that a fair subject to address? Particularly around, we could use lots of things, the press or perhaps Twitter. That's a good one right now, right?
You mean in terms of puncturing pluralistic ignorance and working around the censorship and repression in closed societies, in autocracies?
Yes.
Yeah. So the problem there, there's a lot of hope. A dozen years ago, or 11 years ago, a dozen years ago, with the beginning of the Arab Spring, that thanks to Wael Ghonim and others, that Twitter would make it impossible for dictators to impose their ideology on an entire country, because there'd be peer-to-peer channels that would subvert the top-down control of the autocrats. And it looked like that happened in Egypt. Unfortunately, there is a phenomenon called the dictator's learning curve, was the title of a book, where there's a kind of arms race between people figuring out ways of developing peer-to-peer channels and authorities infiltrating them. And that's the problem with these open grassroots networks is, you know, the great thing is anyone can join, and the terrible danger is anyone can join. And so you do get also the networks of sometimes suspicion and even paranoia that Sebastian spoke about, where there's constant vigilance for who might be infiltrating either a face-to-face social network or an electronic one. And dictators have developed means to use that to their advantage. Who, in this cat and mouse game, the spy versus spy game, or this arms race, you know, I personally don't know how to mobilize these channels so that the networks of intimidation and punishment that prevent the truth from being publicly expressible can be properly subverted. That is, so that these spirals of silence can be exposed, like as in the Emperor's New Clothes. But it is there's not a simple answer to how it can be done, but it is an essential question.
Thank you so much, Natasha. Thank you so much, Sebastian. It's impossible to not mention it's going to be a year since this all began in 2 days, and you being here means everything to us, really. Thank you so much for coming. Natasha, do you want to say one last final goodbye?
Yeah, well, once again, I'm not here. I'm there, right? So I'm thinking about this 1,000 families, and I'm just like, please, 1,000 families more. I'm ready. If you're ready, I'm ready. I have a team. Katya is done. So we have people ready to fly from here to Kherson or Kharkiv. It's risky. It like roads are mined. But we'll get there, and we'll get to those villages, and we'll find those people, and they'll get what you guys want to give them, and they'll decide specifically what they need. Thank you.